Good afternoon from the East Coast for our next edition of Cengage Group's LinkedIn Live series. And today we will be discussing the next iteration, the next phase of the online skills education boom. And the question really that has rightly become the center of attention is, well, online skills education seems to be a good thing, seems to be here to stay. But how do we measure really outcomes and its success? And in today's education landscape, many learners are facing a growing number, thankfully, a growing number of pathway and choices to gain employable skills. And they are sitting there struggling to determine what path will give them the best value for their money, the best value for the time that they're investing. At the same time, employers continue to face a talent crisis. Nearly 2/3 of employers are still struggling to find qualified talent, according to the new data that we just published. And while the majority feel that removing degree requirements would help them find qualified candidates, nearly half of them are grappling with how to measure the value of skills, credentials, and certifications that people might obtain. With this skills market growth, many are starting to question if we're heading towards another for-profit education boom and then a bust, which, for those of you who remember, we went through that with for-profit colleges about 15 years ago. So what as an industry have we learned? What can we learn? And how can we ensure that the learners are receiving a quality education where outcomes are both measurable as well as valued by employers? So that's the question in front of us. And I could not think of two more qualified people to help me unpack that question than Maria Flynn, who is joining us today. And she's the president and CEO of Jobs for the Future, and importantly, a leading voice on the future of work, as well as on the equity in education and workforce opportunity. I'm also delighted to be joined by Matt Siegelman, who is the president of Burning Glass Institute and a valued leader and a pioneer in the labor market when it comes to talent and skills and trends. Welcome to both of you.
It's great to be here.
Great to be together, Michael.
Thank you for joining me again. And let's start with sort of a very basic truth that has been the truth for, I would argue, decades in the United States, which is the traditional wisdom was, you go to college. I have 3 sons, they're all going to college. When you go to college, you get a good job. And then you'll have a pathway to the middle class. Now, I'm always reminding myself and everybody who's listening, that has been true traditionally as the conventional wisdom, but only about 40%, shy of 40% of people actually got a college degree. So while that has been the conventional wisdom, it's not necessarily been true for 60% of the population. And today, the learners, as I said, have a choice, and they have increasing amounts of choices. And first question to you, Maria, how do learners best navigate these choices? And would you agree that these alternatives are becoming more attractive and palatable? And then how do you as a learner figure out which path to take?
Yeah, I think it's a great series of questions. And I loved your intro, Michael, because I think you did a great job of summarizing, I think, this challenging, but yet I think exciting moment that we're in as a nation, where I think we're at a point where this idea of multiple high quality pathways is really taking on some new energy. I think somewhat, fueled from the COVID experience, from virtual learning and virtual work, the issues around the cost of higher ed and student loan debt. My oldest daughter is dropping her off at college in a couple of days, so I'm in the midst of it myself. But I think the biggest challenge we have, I feel, as a nation is around navigation. I think that we do not have really at scale, equitable, high quality ways for individuals, whether they are high school students or parents, or if you're a worker who's 45 and looking to reskill and change jobs. I think it is hard for you to get reliable, actionable information to help you make the best decisions. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done. I think exciting work that's being piloted, both kind of at the policy level, at the practice level, in the private sector that can help us do that. But one report I want to mention, JFF just released about a week ago called Degrees of Risk. And it's a report that we put out in partnership with American Student Assistance. And it really is based on a survey that we did both of Gen X workers and learners and also of employers. And it really highlights this feeling of risk. So 65% of the Gen Z folks that were surveyed really expressed that they feel, a lot of fear and risk around possibly choosing the wrong post-secondary pathway. So I think that there is a real need for us to start to bring clarity around this. As Credential Engine has said, there's over 1 million degrees or credentials in the country, but we have a very, very hard way of maneuvering that and kind of working our way through the maze. Similarly, Georgetown University has done some great work around the ROI on degrees, but not in a very actionable, way do we produce that information. I tried to get my daughter to look at it and was interested for about 10 seconds, right?
Same here, Maria.
So how do we kind of bridge the gap between, the data that's available? And this is a lot of the work that Matt does. I'll turn this over to him, how do we use the data that's available and becoming more available and putting that in the hands of the folks in meaningful and equitable ways?
Well, and I think, a lot of that comes down to being able to, make sure that those data are in the hands of all the stakeholders who need them, right? So we need to make sure that workers and learners have access to and are empowered with better information than they have today. We need to make sure, second, that institutions have them. And then third, I think there's a set of questions here around fit. Which, there's a logical set of questions around career navigation and making sure that people can have awareness of the opportunity landscape. But there's another part of this, which I think we tend to undervalue in these discussions about what choices work best for each individual. I think it's sort of worth breaking this down. By the way, I just want to also second Maria's comment, Michael, that this is a great place, and thank you for starting us off here, because the reality is that if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, we wouldn't be starting necessarily with the same recognition that we have to do well for the other 60%. We've, I think, thankfully moved, had a great deal of progress and had good momentum over the last decade or two in moving away from a college for all, kind of dogma to one that says, hey, we need to make sure that all workers, all learners are winding up in good careers with high mobility, which is, I think, a much more effective standard. So let me first come back to this question of how do we empower workers more effectively with the kind of information that they need? Because to Maria's point about this being, a singularly important challenge, I feel like today we actually, the way that people get advice about how to direct themselves is really no different from the kind of advice that Dustin Hoffman got in The Graduate. He's told plastics. We would give different advice today, but the kind of the insipidness of it is probably not particularly changed. And so I think this means recognizing that this needs to start at high school. and continue throughout somebody's career arc. I say high school because I think the reality is that the majority of American high schools, I'd say the significant majority of American high schools, to the extent that they have anything close to adequate advising resource, it is really very focused on helping students pick the right college. So for those students who aren't going on to college, what's the right launch pad job? How do you differentiate two jobs that seem to pay the same? They're completely absent from being able to provide that kind of advice. And what we know from our research is that what job you start in matters a great deal. We know that there are also sets of jobs that you can aim toward that don't require a college degree that pay very well. What are they? How do you get there? And students need that information. Workers need that information along the course of their journey. Jobs are changing fast. New opportunities are arising. Sometimes people have many of the right sets of skills. How can they see what that opportunity landscape looks like? Yes, to Maria's point, we need to be able to expand things like the college scorecard, or some of be able to apply more effectively some of the work that others like Tony Georgetown are doing. And I think there's some specific things we can do there around expanding that to non-degree learning, measuring not only outcomes, but alignment, so it's more responsive. But a lot of this is about having an infrastructure. Look, I spent 2 decades building the company that's now Lightcast. The kind of data that are out there today, whether from Lightcast or others, are incredibly powerful. But they are not in the hands, there's no national infrastructure for this.
Absolutely. And I would add to that, and I think both of you kind of touched on it, but I want to make it an emphatic point, and I'm not sure there's a short-term solution, which is there is stigma attached to anything that is not a degree. And the stigma comes not only from job requirements that employers have, but the stigma comes also from the people talking about this are typically people who have a degree. Yes. And we don't have enough role models of people who actually successfully navigated an alternative course of action and actually were very successful with it. When you hear the odd story about, Bill Gates dropping out of college and then becoming a billionaire, but that's not what carries the majority of people, or the inspiration that people have. And as I said, I don't have a perfect answer for that, but I do think this kind of dialogue about that it is okay to look at alternatives, in my mind, is critically important. I don't know how you guys feel about it.
Great. I think the narrative change need is huge. I think it's one of the biggest challenges that we have. And I think, again, that kind of cuts across these same sets of stakeholders, right? It's parents, it's counselors. My daughter came home after her first kind of like guidance class her senior year, and said that the question that they asked the class was, do you want to go to a college or a university? And that was like the baseline entrance, question to the discussion, which she thought was pretty ridiculous. But so I think there is good work that's being done by Opportunity at Work. That's really looking at how do we change the narrative on a national scale. So I think that's definitely something to watch. But I think we need the right role models. We need to be getting the messages to the right leaders and decision makers, and then most importantly into the hands of workers and learners and their families.
Absolutely. And let me turn a little bit, if I may, and Matt, I'd love to start with your perspective on this. The role of the employer, and I run a company with 4,500 people, so I'm living it every day as well as an employer. So the role of the employer, there is, to me, a bit of a weird situation that we have. On the one hand, a lot of people, a lot of CEOs, many of them have signed pledges. We're going to remove degree requirements because we don't think degrees are actually indicative of what we need and we're going to be better on figuring out exactly what the skills are that we need for the job. So degree is not necessarily something that we put it as a barrier. Then you look at the implementation of that, and it's abysmal. It's nobody has really made significant traction because I don't think fully understand that this is a massive change effort that the hiring managers run a huge risk of hiring somebody without a degree, and they don't want to run that risk. So without a massive change effort, it's not really going to happen. And at the same time, employers are crying, including myself, guilty as charged, like, oh my God, we have got a skills gap. So we need people with better skills, and we can't hire people fast enough. Matt, what's your perspective on that? Are we whining and not eating the stuff that we serve others?
So a couple thoughts here. First, we've actually done a lot of research in this area and released a report a couple of months back on the progress of skills-based hiring. The good news here is that there's actually been a lot more progress than we may be giving it credit for. The percentage of jobs that sort of are in that middle category of job, lawyers will always need a college degree, right? But if you sort of take out those kinds of jobs, the percentage, and likewise a cashier never did and never will, the percentage of jobs that need a college degree today where employers are asking for one is down about 15% over the last 5 years. And interestingly enough, from our analysis, a lot of that is structural as opposed to just cyclical, because it's a tight labor market. That said, and by the way, I think to your point, part of the reason there's a big part of the reason for that, the motivation is today that exactly as you described, there's actually a dual imperative that companies are facing. On the one hand, to be able to address talent shortages, and therefore an imperative to look more broadly, and second, a growing recognition among companies of the imperative of building a more diverse company, and therefore likewise to be able to look more broadly. So we are seeing progress, but to your point, that progress is uneven. In our analysis, we found a lot of instances of companies which are making big pronouncements, and I think with real sincerity, making commitments. And then when we looked at their actual hiring behaviors, we saw very significant disjoints. A lot of the tech companies, for example, but certainly not singularly. And so I think a lot of this comes down to two things. One, our willingness to translate and the hard work it takes to translate policy to practice. And second, how we can provide for employers more effective credentials that provide alternatives to a degree. In terms of that first thing, in terms of the bridge between policy and practice, we know that there's a big distance between exclusive hiring practices, ones that are designed to filter, and inclusive ones which are designed to broaden. And so, this is where, just like with any other kind of unintentional bias, where you need to have a process audit to look at whether it be algorithms, whether it be the actual steps in a process to make sure that they aren't biasing against people who don't have degrees. In terms of the alternative credentials, this one's really important, because without something else, we're asking employers to do a whole lot of work to validate whether somebody has the skills that are needed for a job. And by the way, in a lot of cases, degrees aren't all that effective at it, but it's an easy proxy, and that's why employers have used it. Maria mentioned a breathtaking statistic before, and I wanted to double click on it. She said, the US Chamber's Credentials Engine project is tracking something like 1 million certifications that are out there today. I always have to remind myself that there are 140,000 words in the Oxford English Dictionary, and we have 1 million credentials that are out there. So, our problem is not that we don't have enough alternative credentials. Our problem is that we haven't invested enough of them with currency.
I think that's a great way of putting it. And Maria, I want to segue over to you, because you've spent a lot of time very effectively in the policymaking arena and in Washington around those things. What role do you think policymakers have in this? Because the 1 million credential into something that I can actually action as a hiring manager, not as a CEO, because that is really the question of how can somebody in the organization who hires actually make those decisions? What role do policymakers in your mind play?
Yeah, so I was encouraged in President Biden's State of the Union address this year. He really called out skills-based hiring, which I think in itself was, a really great step forward. Interestingly, President Trump had actually issued an executive order encouraging the federal government itself to pursue more skills-based hiring. President Biden's like continuing that, also looking at extending that to not just be federal staff, but also federal contractors, right? So that would be a great, I think, like at scale movement to start kind of getting things going in the right direction. He also called for research and development investment to really help look at, what's the technology that's needed to help employers move in this direction. Because it's similar to what Matt was saying, the challenge of going from policy to practice. Like I hear very often employers saying, yes, I am totally on board with this, but what do I do first, right? So I think the federal government does have a role to play in kind of helping to accelerate some of those advancements and helping and incentivizing employers to put those policies into action. So I think, we'll see if any of that gets traction in the appropriations process, but I think it's encouraging that at least the federal government is like signaling these things. And I think on the point around how you give, these vast numbers of credentials some currency, earlier this year, JFF acquired a small entity called EQUOS, which stands for Education Quality Outcome Standards. And so we're going to be working to really use the EQUOS framework, which is really all about looking at quality of, alternative credentials and really trying to use that as, a framework that we can scale across educators, employers, learners to bring some kind of common way of talking about these issues and making it easier for employers to know, what's good and what isn't. So I think we're, kind of at the beginning stages of some really interesting work.
And what I think is interesting in what you're saying, so the policymakers can have a very meaningful role to sort of help people navigate and stratify. Completely agree with you. But at the end, it's also really every participant has to be willing to embrace and say, like, I'm going to challenge the way we did things in the past. And I want to ask you, Matt, like higher ed institutions, we have what, 7,500 of them around the country. They all are facing gradual, in some cases, very steep declines in enrollments that they're faced with. What is their role in this brave new world? Are they just headed for extinction? And like what Clayton Christensen said, like 50% of them won't be there. I don't know. What's your take?
So I think reports of the death of higher education in America are greatly exaggerated. I think higher education institutions are going to play a very important role going forward, if for no other reason than that's the infrastructure we have that has scale. The kinds of the need for reskilling that we see in the market today, the need for upskilling that we see in the market today is profound. From our past research, one of the things we know is that we recently found that 37% of the skills of the average job have been replaced just over the last 5 years. And that's actually accelerated over the second half of that 5 years. When we think about what that means for people's ability to keep up, let alone to get ahead, it means that everyone's going to need to be able to acquire new skills on the fly. I think we've seen a very positive explosion of demand and utilization of online resources, but at the end of the day, America needs its community college system. It needs its higher education system. But at a time, exactly as you said, when those institutions are seeing significant declines in enrollment, we need to be thinking bigger, not how do we keep the 17 million enrollments in higher education today at 17 and not 16 or 15, but how does that become 30 million by 2030? And the way it does is not by competing for more, for the 2 or 3 million high school graduates a year. It's by recognizing that there's almost 40 million Americans who have some college, no degree. There's 160 million people in the US workforce who, all of whom need to acquire new skills. When higher education can align itself more effectively to the market with greater agility, greater responsiveness, then I think it's going to be a very powerful force. It's got the presence and it's got the brand. And particularly until we have credentials of value, the issuer of, or the institution that is saying we've taught something, its brand matters. And particularly in local communities, higher education institutions have that.
I couldn't agree more, and I want to weave that tapestry that we're starting to build between all the different constituents a little bit further, because I would very much agree, Matt, what you said about the existing infrastructure of colleges has scale, right? They do have scale and they have brand, and therefore they should have a very important role to play. At the same time, I think providers, EdTech providers, and any other providers like ourselves, like Cengage Group, we have a responsibility to help them build that scale effectively across institutions, because Bunker Hill Community College in Boston, although it's a big community college, they in and of itself cannot possibly invest the necessary amount of money to build high quality online courses. So what we do with, for instance, with our Ed2Go offering, which is a specific example of that, is we allow them to actually repurpose that, use the content and the technology that we've built, and then be able to actually use it in different community colleges across the country. I very much believe, and I'm dating myself, Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. I believe all education is local, and you absolutely said rightly, the brand name of an institution matters nationally or locally. But I do think we can actually have our cake and eat it, in the sense that we can provide, if we work together in an effective way, we can provide the scale that a local institution not necessarily is able to muster themselves. Yeah. And I see you nodding in agreement, Maria, so chime in on that.
Yeah, I very much believe that partnerships is the way forward, because I think, definitely echo Matt's point around the need for, whether it be 2-year or 4-year colleges, to be more responsive and agile. And I think because, like, by and large, they have not been, is I think largely why we're seeing lots of new types of providers, new approaches coming up and scaling, and also employers that are starting to build their own solutions, in-house, because they're finding that the higher ed system isn't meeting their needs. So, I think the more that we can find ways for institutions to take advantage of, ed tech platforms and scale opportunities, I think is a great way forward, because I think we want to be kind of taking the best of both worlds and, build student-centered designs around them. So I like the idea of, kind of bringing the two together.
Matt, what's your perspective?
I think exactly to Maria's point, we need to create more systematic, more programmatic ways of helping both schools and employers be more effective at bridging the gap. That's often a wide gulf in the market today. From a school perspective, we see the need to be able to create more effective and more responsive alignment with the market. Again, sort of data and the like are out there, but many institutions haven't necessarily built the capacity to really be able to leverage them effectively. And I think this is, again, a place where ed tech providers, others can build into core decision systems the kind of insight that will help make sure that programs are better aligned. It's also about creating, as we were saying before, and Maria just said, agility. That's a really important part of this, because again, without the right kind of infrastructure, it takes a long time to start a program. And we're talking about a job market that's moving very fast, where there are going to need to be, where skills have a rapidly declining half-life. Institutions need to be able to be responsive, but if it takes you 24 months to launch a new program, and if it costs you millions of dollars to launch a new program, You just aren't going to be able to do that effectively. And so similarly, you need to have a review process, right? Like right now, most programs get reviewed on a accreditation cycle of every 7 years. And so the ability to have a set of platforms that drive that review to be much more frequent every year, every other year, can really assure student success. On the other hand, we need to make sure that there's a similar infrastructure of connection for employers. Employers, have supply chains for every commodity that's important to them, except the biggest factor of production in most companies, which is their talent. And having a more of a supply chain driven approach is, in my mind, sort of, it means doing some of the kind of basic things that you would do in any other kind of supply chain. I mean, you have to define what you need, right? Like if you're signaling to any other kind of supplier, you have a very clear spec, you have an automated linkage to your suppliers, to your vendors, indicating how much you need of what. Imagine if you're General Motors and you're saying, hey, we're going to be producing some Silverados and we need some seats. Send us what you have. And we'll decide whether they fit in the truck. It doesn't work that way. So we need to define the specs. And also, like with any other relationship of supplier and purchaser, you need to be able to have a more effective evaluation system. You need to be able to, fire your bad suppliers. You need to be able to give more business to your good ones. And those are some of the kind of linkages that technology providers and data providers can support.
Absolutely. And Matt, I want to take that opportunity to start rounding out our discussion and coming back to where we started, which is, I was, and I think both of you were at various conferences. I was at the ASU GSV conference at the beginning of the year, and you couldn't turn a corner without somebody throwing at you online scale. The valuations of these companies, it reminded me of the .com boom area, where anything you could say, I remember these commercials, as long as it had a .com attached to it, it was worth billions and billions of dollars. So I think we're in these boom bust cycles, and I think we're coming out of the boom cycle and we're going more into the realistic cycle. And I do think that what's really critically important where we started this conversation is that we commit to and agree on what the outcome is that we want to achieve. And I don't think we need to make it overly complicated, right? For a lot of people, the real outcome is, did I get a job or did I get a job with a higher pay? And you can, debate, and we've debated learning outcomes for a long, long time without much effect on the market, really. But I think this is actually a beautifully measurable outcome, and it's a beautifully simple outcome in many respects as well. And Maria, I mean, I know you are very dedicated to that thought. So what do you think we could do to advance that discussion, that it's become a practical outcome-based measure?
Yeah, so there's, I think two strands that I'm looking at. So one is, how do we leverage a framework, such as EQUOS that we're working on at JFF, or others, where we can start to bring some, unified voice and way of looking at outcomes to the field, and how do we scale that, and how do we really get some upfront traction. The other, venue, I think, is through federal policy. And so while to date we haven't been successful in getting a provision passed that would enable Pell Grants to be used for short-term credentials, we're hopeful that in the next Congress that we'll see that pass. It's our understanding that, in the event that the Republicans take the House in the next Congress, that there is interest in the education leaders there to push this through and to ensure that online providers are included in eligibility, which I think is terrific. It's something we're very supportive of. But in order to make this happen and to really have it be successful, having that understanding of, what is high quality, how do we know it, how do we get that information, is really going to be key. So I think, to me, this next year is a really critical time for us to start to come together as a field and move this dialogue forward. I feel for many years we've been stuck in the like, oh, we can't do that because it's risky. And I think we need to really shift the dialogue to say like, let's do it and let's find out, the way to do it well.
Completely agree. Matt, what's your perspective?
I would, so first of all, by the way, Michael, I would just add one, I agree with you. We don't need to be overly complicated in how we measure outcomes, but I would add one other one, which is the extent to which not only, are people getting a job, are they getting better pay, but also are they moving up? And we think the assessment of and measurement of mobility in America today, at a time when the American dream is increasingly challenged, is one that I think needs to be front and center in every conversation. I think in terms of how we can develop the kind of the clear-headedness that this, as you put it, more realistic cycle will require, it comes down to three things. One, being certification first. Two, having clearer metrics of the kind that Maria was just referring to. And three, having more effective and more direct relationships between providers and employers. In terms of being certifications first, I think we desperately need an ecosystem that's defined by clearly accepted high currency credentials that people can hold on to, and I think that's what's going to give greater confidence in for-profit providers and alternative providers. If you look at kind of where the for-profit education system today has continued to work, it's been around parts of the ecosystem where there are clearly accepted credentials. So for example, in the world of nursing, there continue to be respected for-profit providers, folks like Rasmussen College, for example, because there's the NCLEX. And at the end of the day, there's a clear standard, right? Either, what's the pass rate on the NCLEX? And if a private provider is doing that, then so be it. Second, so I think, if we can have that kind of infrastructure, I think it will give greater confidence to be more expansive about the range of options. In terms of clear metrics, I think Maria's already said so much there that's really important. But I think I would just add that we need to make sure that those metrics are at both the program level and at the provider level. Mm-hmm. A lot of the metrics today are program level, and the evaluation of outcomes is inherently in the rearview mirror of longitudinal data. And longitudinal data, don't get me wrong, is a great gold standard. How have people progressed over the course of several years? But if we want to be able to have a more agile, more responsive education and training environment, then we can't, for let's say there's a skill that people need that may not be here in 3 or 4 years, waiting several years to see, kind of how graduates of that program did is not going to provide us a really good outcome standard. So we need to be able to evaluate the program and also the institution or the provider's track record overall and see if it's a quality provider. And then finally, I mentioned direct relationships. And we can have more effective credentials. We can have more effective, better standards. But there is no substitution for that level of that kind of the shoe leather work of driving effective connections. And I think the best providers today are out there building bridges with employers. The best employers out there are recognizing that training providers are really critical partners in making sure that the workforce they have can be the workforce they need going forward.
Which is a great segue to me. First and foremost, thanking both of you for a really interesting and most enjoyable discussion, and leave you and to our audience with two thoughts. One is, from this discussion, it really strikes me that it can be true that things are not where they need to be, but there still can be like really positive progress at the same time. And I think that's where we are. and I am always highly skeptical of the people that are either the doomsday scenario or the, everything is going to be different tomorrow scenario. So that's one thought. We can live in both worlds with that juxtaposition. And the other one is, and I'm always humbled by the fact that I'm leading an organization that's been around for 100 years and really starting with the Gutenberg, print technology at the time that, I think we have to be a little bit patient with ourselves in the sense that, yes, there are urgent crises to be solved, but I do also think we got to remind ourselves that progress will take time, and we got to be a little bit patient, and we got to work on it. And I applaud both of you for really coming in at times of saying, like, we all have a responsibility together. It's not just one. It's not the finger pointing on the policymakers or the employers or the providers. So with that, I just want to thank both of you for a terrific conversation. And I know this is a starter of the conversation. We will answer all the questions. I will say this on your behalf. We will answer all the questions on LinkedIn Live, and I'm looking forward to the continuation of the dialogue. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael, Maria.